what are the challenges? What are the challenges in receiving them in Poland, in big and small cities?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Marta, for this very kind invitation, and welcome all of you. So I tried to prepare something like this summary current situation, but you know it very well. The situation is very liquid, very flexible. And unfortunately, you know, maybe this is what I will say in the next 10-15 minutes will change during my presentation, because the situation is really liquid. But of course, I try to prepare some my remarks, because I try to monitor the situation for weeks since 24th of February, and I don't want to waste the time, and that's why let me go to my summary. I don't think so that I will take more than 10, maybe 12 minutes, as Marta said. You have to know that today the number of crossings at the border with Ukraine has exceeded 2 million. It is over 60% of all Ukrainians who have fled the country so far. Among this group which relocated to Poland, approximately 97% were people with Ukrainian citizenship. Most of the foreign nationals living in Ukraine before the war and who came to Poland after its outbreak have already left and returned to their countries of origin. This applies in particular to students who have studied at Ukrainian universities and employees of international companies. Poland decided to open border for them, but they were obliged to leave Poland within 15 days. That's why we didn't have the equal treatment of the, I can say, escapers or the refugees from Ukraine, because on the one hand, we decided to prepare special law, which I will speak later on, for the Ukrainians, but the people from Ukraine who directly cross the Polish and Ukrainian border. But now is the new amendment for this new law, which this word directly will be deleted. But unfortunately, now we have the situation that the foreigners with no Ukrainian citizenship have to leave Poland during the 15 days. But also this assistance is not provided for the people who, for example, cross the border with Slovakia, Ukraine and Slovakia, the Slovakian border, or Ukraine-Hungarian border, and came via these countries, this transit country, to Poland. The assistance is not provided for them. That's why it is the problem, but I think so this problem will be solved in the next few days. Due to Poland's membership in the Schengen area, the lack of border controls, it is very difficult to determine the number of Ukrainians who are actually under the care of Poland, Polish society, and Ukrainian minority. Our estimations show that there are currently approximately 1.2–1.3 million Ukrainians who are refugees in Poland. They mainly stay in large cities such as Warsaw, Krakow, or Wrocław. The rest of those who crossed the Polish border went to other EU member states or other countries outside of Europe, such as Canada or the USA, where their families and friends live. The Polish government has decided to use the login data of mobile phones registered in Ukraine to the relay stations. Unfortunately, the data is difficult to interpret and will have to be repeated 2 or 3 times in the short period of time in the future. I can say that first result of this analysis should be known in a week's time. Despite the passage of more than 3 weeks since the beginning of the war and the influx of refugees from Ukraine to Poland, assistance to refugees is mostly provided by Polish families and households, as well as by owners of guest houses and hotels who made them available for the purposes for providing accommodation. The level of mobilization among the non-governmental organizations, grassroots initiatives, private citizens is really amazing. For example, in the first days, Polish families sheltered several 100,000 refugees, often in their own houses or apartments. There are basically 2 social groups from Ukraine and Poland: women with children and older persons over the age of 60. This is a result of the internal regulations in Ukraine, which prohibit men between the age of 18 and 60 from leaving the country. Among those, they have managed to escape the war. There is a large group of people who require very specialized support. For example, children suffering from oncological diseases, or the elderly with a high degree of disability. So far, these groups have been provided with the necessary support, but if these needs become more frequent, it will be necessary to review the capacity of the Polish healthcare system and system of support for disabled people. For a long time, the Polish government held the position that there would be no need to build refugee centers. Currently, over 150,000 people are staying in these types of temporary accommodations facilities. However, these centers are not sufficiently adapted for stays longer than a few days, maximum week. A special law, what I have mentioned already, a special law on assistance to refugees from Ukraine was adopted last week. Its aim is to stabilize the situation of Ukrainians in Poland by giving them an identification number that will allow them to enter the labor market and obtain support from social assistance. The procedure is the same as in the case of Polish citizens. Potentially, based on the recent numbers, up to 1.1 million Ukrainians may apply for an individual identification number in the near future. We expect a lot of different administrative problems and queues in the local offices. New law provides also reimbursement of the cost of hosting refugees from Ukraine in Polish family homes and private hotels. The government has agreed to cover the value of around €8 per day for each person. However, receiving this refund requires submitting a special application to the local administration offices. It is extremely difficult to predict how many Poles will be entitled to get this reimbursement. What is also very important to say that Ukrainians who also supported their families, for example, or colleagues or friends, are not able to get this reimbursement. What is, I can say, also very problematic. Ukrainian children can be enrolled in Polish schools. It will also be possible to open school branches in temporary accommodation centers, as well as parallel Ukrainian classes inside Polish schools. At present, however, the preferred model is the inclusion of Ukrainian children in Polish classrooms. In my opinion, this is a very wrong approach. It is not possible to include more than 500,000 Ukrainian children during the school year to Polish schools. A hybrid model would definitely be more effective here. Currently, only around 10% of Ukrainian children have entered Polish schools so far. Numerous challenges connected with this integration process are expected. The priority is to involve children in education as fast as possible so that they do not lose time while living in Poland from the point of view of their educational development. Unfortunately, contrary to the advice of experts, the Act does not provide, this new law does not provide guidelines for a simplified system for recognizing the qualification of teachers, educators, and psychologists from Ukraine. Until the middle of last week, the Polish government didn't apply for support from other EU member states. Now this position has changed. Over the past weekend alone, more than 20 trains were organized, which made it possible for refugees interested in moving, for example, to Germany, to leave Poland. Local administration in Gdańsk organized, for example, ferries to relocate refugees to Sweden. A future relocation is expected in the near future. However, it is completely different than the relocation scheme which took place during the migrant crisis in 2016. Relocation of Ukrainian refugees is carried out on voluntary rather than compulsory or mandatory basis. This is very difficult to predict what will happen in the next days or weeks. It depends mainly on the situation in Ukraine. However, it should be emphasized that Poland is managing the migration challenge quite well. However, as I already mentioned, this is due to the exceptional commitment of civil society. Certainly, in the coming months, Poland will not be able to cope with the integration of more than 800,000 people into the labor market on the education system. Of course, it is possible to provide ad hoc support, but that is completely different than integrating refugees into Polish society. Ukrainians are still treated as guests who are expected to return to their homes when possible. Such an assumption should not be changed until May, when the situation in Ukraine will be more predictable. We must also be aware that we are dealing with the dispersed families who will want to reunite as soon as possible. It is not known, however, whether this will take place in Poland or in Ukraine. It depends, of course, on how the situation develops in the weeks and months to come. It is in the coming weeks, the key issues will be the relocation of Ukrainian refugees from large to smaller cities on the territory of Poland, as well as within the European Union. It is absolutely necessary to coordinate activities both at the level of the Polish government and the European Commission, for example, to avoid the problem concerning the human trafficking. It is also necessary to appoint a team coordinating the actions of voivodes who are responsible for crisis management in accordance with Polish law. It is also absolutely necessary to ensure the flow of information between local administration and the government, as well as coordinate the activities of non-governmental NGOs, whose activity is key in dealing with the challenges related to the migration crisis. In the next stages, it will be necessary to adopt a systematic approach to the inclusion of Ukrainian children in the education system. I mentioned that before. Polish and Ukrainian, but functioning in Poland, remote learning might be the solution. And other refugees to the labor market. And last but not least, I would like to finish now, but last but not least, one more assumption can be made. If the situation in the west of Ukraine does not worsen and the conflict will be frozen in the east, some Ukrainians may also decide to return, even temporarily, to Ukraine. In another, much worse scenario, internally displaced persons who are currently staying near Lviv or Ivano-Frankivsk in the west of Ukraine may find their way to Poland. If Putin will start to bombard, for example, Lviv and Ivano-Frankivsk, we have to expect the next wave of refugee from Ukraine. It is also possible that some of the refugees currently staying in Romania and Hungary will decide to come to Poland due to the scale of the age of the support from the Polish society, positive social attitude, and linguistic similarity. But the social attitude can change in the near future because more and more Ukrainians in the Polish society, we can expect some problems with the integration then. It's in the end of the day, we should expect some tensions between the Ukrainians and Poles, because we are starting to observe also, for example, the internet, the new, I can say, narratives on staying the Ukrainians Polish society. I can stop here, and then later on, if you have any questions, I will try to respond, or maybe to say a little bit more about the different aspects of integration of Ukrainians in Polish society. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Maciej, for this very complex and quick overview of the recent developments, but also of the possible problems and challenges that will arise in the future. So now, Magda, the floor is yours. And also, as the representative of the Union of Polish Metropolises, I would like to ask you to provide you with the overview of the situation in the cities, including those you are working with in the union. Maybe also a few words about this legal context, how this new law that we have on assistance to citizens of Ukraine might be implemented if the cities see any problems or any gaps in this new law while thinking and designing their actions and specific policies for the future. So the floor is yours. You have 10 minutes.
Thank you, Marta. For the beginning, I would like to say that person who can stay until the end, it's me, but I give you my address email. So if you have some question or you need some information, you can write to me. So maybe I will say a few words about Union of Polish Metropolises. This is foundation associating 12 large Polish cities. The union consists of Białystok, Bydgoszcz, Gdańsk, Katowice, Kraków, Lublin, Poznań, Rzeszów, Szczecin, Warszawa, Wrocław. So this is local governmental organization, how we see. The goals of the UPM is support our cities in their effort to develop socially and economically and disseminate good practice in modern and innovative governance of community of citizens. We work with number of public and private condition for cities, enabling them to provide public services of the highest quality. We also, what is very important for the situation, involved in legislative lobbying, thanks to the participation of the work of the Joint Government and Territorial Self-Governance Commission, Parliamentary Committee, and various influential bodies. UNP, together with cities, consults state documents like acts, policies, programs, like also new act for help for the citizens of Ukraine due to armed conflict in this country. How you heard, the act regulated the scope and forms of assistance to refugee and the method of its financing. Most of tasks will be raised by local government, social assistance, healthcare, education. Government is declaring cover most of this expense, but how we say in Poland, the devil is in the details. We are not sure it will be in practice. In my opinion, I'm not sure if our state can afford such expensive help, especially local governments. We indicate some tweets also with abuse aid by Polish citizens, but also Ukrainian who have lived in Poland for a long time. You should know also that the statutory law of local government units in dealing with matters relating to foreigners is very limited, because that these matters belong to the appropriate organ of government administration, which a large dispersion of responsibility for individual matters and area. The role of local authorities is limited to the implementation of legal solution. And at present, issues related to the broadly understood migration are not included in the optional and obligatory task at this level. And local governments, local action are often an ad hoc, rather than systematic nature. In this situation is also is very similar, because we have act, yes, but we don't have any system. We sign we willing to cooperate with government administration, create some integration policy, immigration policy, in the case of another crisis in Afghanistan or in Belarus, but we have never obtained some answer. Now we have new act, which is not perfect. It needs correction, but give us opportunity to finance humanitarian aid both in Poland and abroad. We can finance refugee stay cost or provide financial aid to cities in Ukraine. It was impossible until now. And how you heard that in Poland is almost 2 million refugees. The government has set up checking points at the border, but people who go there they can stay more or less 2 days and keep going. The large group is traveling on its own, but also they use transport organized by NGOs, people of good willing, and also of free train for them. And most of them stop is big city like Warsaw, yes, Krakow or Lublin. And of course, another our cities, they are prepared to this group, but there's many reasons why they don't want to stay in the smaller cities, maybe because of they try our big cities like transit cities because they want to go to the another countries in Europe, maybe because of possibility to get a job. Or maybe some social connection, yes, because most of them have they have friends, family in Poland who can help them even in accommodation. And of course, in our cities, there are some points of accommodation organized by voivodeship, but also by the cities. I would like to know that for the at the beginning of the war in Ukraine, our voivodeship asked some cities, not all, for indicate place where refugees can stay for nights. It is some kinds of public accommodation. It could be also hotel, and they asked only few cities, not all, but the cities also started prepared, like Szczecin, where live 3,000 people from Ukraine now. We suppose that part of them came back to Ukraine to fight, but at the same time, probably their family, their wife, children, mother, yes, because most of these people who is coming to Poland, this is women and children. They can move to the Szczecin. And this cooperation between the voivodeship and cities is different in different cities, in different voivodeship, and there is some place where it's very good, and some place where there's no contact, or contact is not enough. So this is very difficult to coordinate this cooperation and to find people place for some flat also, but some place for life. And in Warsaw now we suppose that that are almost 300,000 Ukrainian. And this is very difficult for the cities because they don't have enough bed, they don't have enough maybe not foods, yes, because some people help them. Some people mean NGOs and private person. But this is it's not enough. The first thing to put, live in the normal level, and we cooperate with UNHCR, and they propose us to buy some things to put them to this accommodation point. And of course, this situation is not comfortable for refugees, but many people help renting or giving for free their flats, rooms, house, etc.
Magdo, can we ask you for like the very last sentence summarizing so we can keep our time?
Okay, sorry. And So this is accommodation is a huge challenge for us. Education is a huge challenge for us because there are so many children, and we don't want to put them for the Polish system education because it's too difficult for them. And of course, this is very difficult to service these people because we don't have the city so many employees, and I think that is language barriers. This is the huge problem, and we cooperate to help together to help them, our cities, to get good practices, and we are waiting what will be next, because I think that this is the beginning humanitarian crisis, but we must be ready for just living this refugee in our country, even maybe for 1-2 months, because most of the people think that they won't stay here long. But who knows? And it's very difficult to work with people with with trauma also. And I think that we need some system. We need more cooperation with other government, and we need also help in other countries EU. Yes.
Thank you, Magda. So this is a good connection to the second subsection of the main discussion. So Magda, what she did, she just let us know more from this meso level perspective. What are the developments and the early responses or the responses for the future from the cities? So in the meantime, we are copying, pasting different links that might be of your interest in our chat. Also, we see that there are first questions. So please share with us your comments, your opinions, and ask questions to our experts. So now the second part, as I've mentioned, so we have 4 colleagues from other European countries that will comment on a bit on the past. So what has happened in terms of humanitarian or refugee or migration crisis in their countries, and how the cities in these European countries reacted. What are the lessons learned? What are the challenges that these cities faced, and what might be a piece of advice for us? So Poland and Polish cities and local governments. So I would like to start with Lefteris, that was already introduced. So a few words about Greece, about Greek case study in Athens, especially in 2016. So Lefteris, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Marta. I will start by saying that the first image of what would happen in 2015, 2016, was in November 2014. For the first time after a long period, Greeks and people in Athens saw 300 refugees occupying a central square, demanding support, documents, and services. It was, a very bizarre image for the city, but we quickly understood that this is just the beginning of something that in the end, after a year or so, developed to what we call the 2015-2016 refugee crisis. I don't like the term crisis, because if 2015 was a crisis, what are we talking about now? In 2015, we had 1 million people passing through Greece in a year, and now we have in 3 weeks, 3.2 million people fleeing Ukraine. So if 2015 is a crisis, what are we talking about now? It's the same argument that I could use with the term war, because in 2020, for those who remember, in Evros, Greece talked about a war, an invasion, a hybrid war, when Turkey, rightly so, as we say, weaponized migrants and drove them to the Greek border. Greece and Europe responded with the term war. So if 2020 is war, what people in Ukraine face now? So words have a meaning, they have a weight. So we should be very careful on how we use these terms. So I will go back to Athens. In 2015, in the summer, we saw the first big arrivals in the city. We had people living rough in parks and in the street. Very quickly, we took it upon ourselves to provide basic services. So we collaborated with the government and we opened up the first camp of the new era. Back then, it was not very far from the city center. It hosted 700 people. Now, towards the end, it can host 2,000 people. The second thing we did was to coordinate our actions and collaborate with NGOs and international organizations. We have a platform and a mechanism that we call the Athens Coordination Center for Migrants and Refugees, where more than 95 we have more than 95 organizations participating. Not only organizations, we have ministries, the European Commission, small NGOs, local NGOs, but also international NGOs. And the third thing that Athens with Thessaloniki, the second biggest city, developed is a network, a national network of cities for integration. We started out with 11 cities and now we have 18 cities. We moved on then to start our collaboration and use the networks that we participated in, the European city networks. I can mention Eurocities, which was very, very helpful. Gdansk is part of the Eurocities network and we worked with Gdansk also. And it was for Greece, for Athens, it was very useful because let me just remind everyone that the Greek cities do not have the competency in the questions of migration. So this is also a big question mark. What are the competencies of the relevant cities? You have different competencies in Holland, for example, or in France, or in Italy, or in Greece, or in Poland, or in Spain. And it is very difficult to have one policy for all the cities because of the lack of competency. Nevertheless, cities collaborate amongst them because the cities do not know borders. So the collaboration between the cities is easy. And during this difficult period for Athens, we found a lot of support with our colleagues from other cities. I can mention especially Barcelona or the G4 in Holland, the big forum, the four big municipalities of Holland, Utrecht, Amsterdam, Rotterdam, and The Hague. And we did MOUs and we exchanged good practices and we had visits, collaborated in common European projects with German cities also. So for us, this was very, very important to use the experience of other cities and to transpose good practices in the context of the work that we did. Because we have also an Italian colleague, I would say that we had an excellent collaboration also with Italian cities, especially Milan, which is very, very active in the context of city diplomacy. The mayor of Milan is someone who is very, very active at the international level and is pushing for this diplomacy of cities and has a very important role in the international scene. For Athens, this was extremely important, extremely important. The basic thing that we did after that is to develop service provision. As you know, the most important thing and the basic thing for a city to do is to provide services to everyone, independently of their legal status or where they come from or who they are, etc. So we tried to develop specific services for migrants and refugees. It was the first time that we did in Greece. It has gone well, but we need to keep pushing because after the first period, we now have a second refugee crisis. Greece is also participating in this new reality. We have a very thriving Ukrainian community. We have more than 20,000 people who live legally in Greece. And we have we have Greek Ukrainians who live, more than 150,000 of them live in Mariupol and other cities, in Odessa also, and people are coming to Greece. So this is something that we also need to deal with. I will make some recommendations. People who have worked, we worked a lot with other cities, and I would recommend the Polish cities to do the same. Do networking, amongst yourselves, network with other European cities and colleagues in order to get good practices and transpose their experience into Poland. I know that the experience of some of the Polish cities is vast. For example, I will talk about again about Gdańsk, who has policies on the integration of migrants for a long period now and has a very good experience, and now push the government to take measures for the long term. What we saw in 2015, 16, 17, etc., is that in many cases, cities were fighting their national government. We saw cities having very progressive policies and getting obstacles from their national government. We saw that in France, in Spain, in Holland, sometimes in Greece, and we saw that also at the level of the European Union. The Union failed to promote a European approach, a European solution, because member states had divergent opinions on the way that we should deal with this, what we call back then, crisis. I have to remind you that today it's the 6th anniversary of the EU-Turkey Common Declaration, which is the tool of the implementation of a policy of deterrence from the part of the EU, using Greece and Turkey as the watchdogs, as the barrier for people to enter. Today, the Vice President of the Commission said that I do not believe that we had a different treatment of refugees during the crisis in the Ukraine and the previous one, which for me is a hypocrisy. I don't agree at all with this declaration. We have and still have a different approach on these two questions, and this is something very problematic, and we need to discuss it, not now. Now we have an emergency and we have to help people, but at some point we have to face our own hypocrisy. Cities can go above these issues and these political difficulties. We have done it before, we can do it again. I'm not talking as a city now, but I'm using my previous experience. It is something very, very important. Integration happens in the local level. Cities will bear the burden of doing integration, whatever the government decides. People live in cities, not only migrants and refugees, but ordinary citizens, everyday citizens. And the cities will have an increased role in this context. Yes, the pandemic, the financial crisis, etc., have affected their capacity, but when things go back to what we call normal, cities will still have the most important role to play. And for me, it is very, very important for cities to collaborate amongst them, no matter what the national government say. I will stop here and we can discuss after. Thank you.
Perfect, because I just wanted to interrupt you slowly. Thank you, Lefteris. This is a very comprehensive overview and also a piece of policy recommendations, what to do and how to do. So I think that there is a good reference point to discussion. I've already taken some notes. So now the second national and municipal case study. So I would like to give the floor to another colleague of mine, so Pierluigi Musaro from Bologna. So the questions are pretty the same. So what you can tell us about the reaction of Italian cities, big and small, to asylum seekers that were received in Italy, especially in 2015. And Lefteris mentioned a good example of Milan and what he called city diplomacy. If you know this kind of good practice or action in Bologna or in other cities, we are happy to hear more also. Thank you. So Pierluigi, now it's your turn.
Thanks very much, Marta. And yes, I'm just back from Athens. 2 hours ago I arrived, and I was there for a project on climate change and migration. And I was also talking with many people about the situation of refugees in Athens. And I absolutely agree with all what Lefteris just said. I mean, watching the situation from the Mediterranean perspective is really interesting, because what is going on is something that really we experienced. And also I agree with this idea of the cities. So first of all, let me just tell you what was the context of that period. I mean, of 2015, 2016. I mean, after the big tragedy in Lampedusa, then there was the military humanitarian mission called Mare Nostrum. I don't know if you remember that, but this was the first time where the Italian government, only the Italian government with Navy, with police, whatever, was proud to go into the Mediterranean and save people and rescue people. What does it mean this? It means that it changed completely the narratives. Because that time, the idea was that we Italians, we are proud to be kind of social assistant to saving people death. And for a couple of years, like even 3 years, this kind of narrative, I think that reshaped also the answer, the reaction, the attitudes of Italians in front of this so-called crisis or emergency. So there was not anymore the problem of the invasion, but there was the idea of the compassionate, pity, humanitarianism, solidarity with these people. Then let's just point on some things. That period, there was a war, 2 wars that we are not mentioning here, that was burden sharing. Do you remember all the debate about burden sharing? No one is talking anymore since 2016 about burden sharing. That period, I remember there was Renzi, prime minister, and the idea was, you know, that the Italians were kind of the unique solidars in European Union, but then there were especially the Eastern country, included Poland, Hungary, and all the other, who were against this idea of burden sharing. What does it mean, burden sharing? Is the solidarity among the EU members in order to relocate the refugees. Then we completely lost this concept, which is central to me. What happened that time? If you think, I mean, talking about the narrative, I work more on media, but I think that the narrative are central because in a few years, we passed from this idea of humanitarian compassion, humanitarian proudness, to the idea of humanitarian crimes, right? Right now, I mean, what happened that after the picture of Aylan Kurdi, millions of people were kind of legitimate to go through the Balkan route and say, Angela Merkel, please come, we welcome you, mainly the Syrian. But then, as Lefteris was saying, 2016, the Turkey deal, which was not even an agreement. Then 2017, the Italian and Libya agreement. And then the externalization of the border. Right now, Frontex is not only patrolling the Mediterranean, is going in front of Senegal in order to stop people. So this is what European Union agree. Not burden sharing, but all the countries agree on Frontex. And the same countries that right now, and I'm very happy about that, are opening the hugs saying we welcome Ukrainians, were the same countries who were asking for walls, for more walls at the borders of the European Union. So in terms of reaction, I think that it was very interesting to analyze how this kind of answer of the cities and the government changed. For example, during that crisis in Italy, there were only 3,000 places in the reception centers. In a couple of years, they became 23,000. And this kind of centers also were built, created, and you know, Marta, because we are in the same project, Welcoming Spaces, in shrinking areas. It was seen as an opportunity. We have a problem, not only in Italy, about shrinking areas, depopulating areas. So thanks to the refugees, we can repopulate. But the problem was that was the government imposing this kind of big centers. And I agree with Lefteris, it's very important to work at the local level, with cities, with municipalities, because again, it's a sort of burden sharing that we did within the same countries. So for this reason, I think that it's very important also when you talk about, for example, reception, also to mobilize all the the different tools that you have. I mean, talking about the narratives. Right now in Bologna, there are more than 700 private families who open the door for hosting refugees, which I think is also one of the results of this narrative in terms of solidarity. But then I think that it's very, very important also to share the policies and decisions at the local level with the people. I mean, for example, in Bologna, there is since many years a campaign that all the NGOs and cooperatives with the municipality working on refugee reception centers, they do to communicate what they do, which is called Bologna Cares. So I think it's something that is, it's a way to join the forces and to try to explain to the people what these invisible people who just become visible when there is a problem, like being criminals or some accident, whatever, what they do there. For example, when the narratives changed because Salvini arrived and when the urgent security measures, then he changed the narratives, and so it was legitimate to cut the money. I think that Massier was talking about €8 per day. In Italy, in 2015, 16, 17, was 35 euros per day, not to give to the guy, to the refugees, to the person, but to the cooperatives and NGOs working with refugees, which means that you were paying the workers, the food, the police, the rent, whatever, which means you were creating jobs. But then the narratives changed, and then when Salvini arrived, they were just volunteers. So the 35 euros were reduced to 20 euros. And then what happened? That, for example, my wife was working in a cooperative in a reception center. That time, they were 160. Now they are less than 70. It means that also in terms of jobs, of opportunities, of professionality, you can work on that. And then I think it's very important also, and I close, to be very focused on avoiding disparities, because working with this situation, what I have seen in the last years is that several or many Italians, even mayors or whatever, were protesting because we are giving to them some kind of money, services, houses, whatever, while we have others, not only refugees, but also Italians, or Polish in that case, for example, who don't have access to this kind of measures. So in terms of, I think, helping people, of showing solidarity, I think that it's very, very important also at least to try to and to communicate that we are solidar with all the people. So avoiding to create a mechanism when there are the us against the them. Okay, thanks.
Thank you very much, Pierluigi. So you've raised a couple of issues that I would like to stress as a good area to our questions. So you've mentioned the relocation scheme. So just maybe to remind to our audience that this is about the temporary relocation scheme for 2015-2017 that was launched on the basis of the Article 78.3 from the Treaty on the Functioning of the EU. And Poland was among these three countries from the EU member states, and more specifically from Visegrad Group, that did not implement this scheme at all. And what is important, nowadays, I'm receiving a lot of questions from my colleagues that are non-experts in migration studies. Why this time the EU does not help us, I mean Poland and the Polish society, to relocate forced migrants from Ukraine to other EU member states. And among these colleagues asking these questions are also those that were not so enthusiastic about receiving asylum seekers in 2015. So now people expect in Poland to be supported by other EU member states. And I asked unofficially some of my colleagues from the European Commission office in Warsaw if there is anything on the table regarding the launch of this scheme on the basis of the treaty now for Poland or other member states. So far, they did not hear nothing. Also, I'm following official websites of European Commission and DG Home, and I do not see any announcements regarding this issue. So this is not up to the national governments to launch the procedure. This has to be initiated, if I'm correct, and I'm not a legal expert, by the EU level. So relocation within this European context, this is one issue, and another one that you've mentioned is about relocation across the country, and this was also raised by some local governments in the country, because the cities, the big cities receiving asylum seekers are really overloaded, especially in terms of housing, and then it will be really an important issue when we know what is the possible mid-term and long-term settlement scale of Ukrainians. So I think we'll be back to this issue. So now we are moving to another national case study, and this is Alexander Kenneth from Germany. So we would like to hear from you about the initial reception of forced migrants in Germany during the peak of 2015-2016. What we can learn from German case and German cities. So Alexander, the floor is yours.
So thank you for having me. Is the sound working well now? Okay, great, because there were problems earlier. First of all, let me emphatically agree with the consensus we have here that integration reception is literally taking place in cities. I really agree here. At the same time, I may be a bit more skeptical than leftists about the option of transferring good practices from one place to another, since my experience is that there are so complex contextual factors that may impede the implementation, the easy implementation of good practices in many cases, even though the cities themselves may have similar conditions. This is why I would like to start with a brief prolegomena on the German context of federalism and corporatism, because this is the context, of course, in which the cities work and which paves the specific situation of and their degrees of freedom and responsibilities. Then I would like to tackle the situation of reception in Germany in 2015-2016 along the lines of housing, daycare, schooling, labor, health care, and volunteering. And then I would close with some lessons learned, but as I said earlier, these must be taken with care. Just a brief note on the German context, since this is a comparative meeting. Germany is a highly federalist country. That means there is a division of responsibilities also in terms of refugee reception between the national, the regional, and municipal levels. Just as an example, the decision on asylum applications is a national responsibility. The distribution of refugees and final allocation of refugees is a regional responsibility. And at the same time, and this I think resonates with what many of us have said already, almost all practicalities of reception take place on the municipal level, that is in cities and municipalities. Apart from this multi-level system of reception, we have a highly corporatist system. That is, there is a close collaboration between state and societal actors in the production of public goods, such as social welfare. And this also applies to the area of reception. Several associations, some confessional, some non-confessional, compete for public funding for the delivery of welfare services, including refugee reception. And taken together, these two systemic aspects of the German state result in a double complexity, not to say double contingency, in the system of reception, and a high variation and contingency of reception measures. And a colleague of mine in Austria, Sieglinde Rosenberger, has described this pointedly as a lottery, because these different responsibilities come together. It may turn out good for you where you land, and if things work out well, or it may turn out bad. Talking about, this is my main part, the situation in Germany in 2015-16, I think if we take a closer look, and I think there was someone in the chat who has already mentioned it, there are quite some differences in the situation Germany faced in 2015-16 and Poland is facing now. As you might remember, in 2015-16 in Germany, we had 1.6 million asylum applications. This is still less and on a longer time scale than the Ukrainian refugees Poland is taking in now. whereas at that time, the applicants mainly came from Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, and other countries. And I'm just noticing, and I just wanted to point that out here, that we have a vital discussion in the chat going on, mainly on the issue of racism, structural racism. And I would really urge us all to take this up in the final discussion. So this was the number, these were the countries of origin. Like in Poland today, I guess, the first issue was registration. Since refugees in Germany in 2015 came over the Schengen borders, there was no systematic registration in the first place. Hence, there was a strong political need to reform the national registration systems in the second place. And there was, talking about narratives, a strong political rationale of regaining control. And an important instrument of regaining control after this so-called uncontrolled emergency situation was what was then called the paradigm of integrated refugee management. That is the establishment of central refugee accommodation facilities in which all newcomers were channeled in order not to lose track of who has come to our country. So this was the political rationale. The most urgent demand in the first place, and this was served, of course, on the level of cities and municipalities, was housing, or to use a more modest term, shelter. We saw a massive contribution in Germany at that time of emergency aid organizations, such as the Red Cross. They were very important. They were crucial players in putting up tents, organizing containers, organizing transportable beds, all this practical stuff, putting up basic sanitary infrastructure, organizing food and clothing. Then there was a second matter, how can we find, also for a midterm accommodation, this was also an issue brought up here in the discussion, how can we find new accommodation facilities? What we saw in Germany was that big barracks buildings were reused or put back into use as emergency shelters. We saw hotels being, I almost would have said confiscated, but I think the officials would have said subcontracted as emergency shelters. And of course, we saw gyms and other public buildings be reused. At the same time, I think this may be a lesson learned from the German perspective, we saw a surprisingly quick normalization of the situation, since in 2016, in spring, many of the emergency accommodation centers were already closed down again. So the peak was rather short, and then the mechanisms of distribution worked, and the emergency shelters were not needed anymore. In terms of daycare, education, and schooling, in terms of daycare, we had no infrastructure at all at the beginning. If daycare was offered in the accommodation facilities, it was on a loose volunteering basis. And also in subsequent months and years, we only had a slow integration of refugee children in the regular system. This is based on the fact that we have an under supply of early education in Germany anyway, so it is a strong competition going on here. In terms of schooling, it's remarkable that despite compulsory schooling in Germany, children in refugee accommodation centers had no access to regular schooling for at least first 6 months they were staying in Germany. What they did offer, and I also heard a similar approach here in our round, was that they had so-called learning workshops in the accommodation facilities. That is basically 2 teachers and 1 social pedagogue responsible for a whole group of refugee children. And as you can imagine, no sort of systematic schooling is possible in such a constellation. And later on, what we saw, and this touches on something Maciej was mentioning, later on, we saw that regular schools implemented special language learning classes in which all the refugee children were pooled, of course, thus inhibiting contact to German children, but at the same time working on the language competency. Rather rarely did we see a systematic inclusion of refugee children into regular schooling, that is regular German-speaking classes. In terms of labor, it's important to know that in Germany, while your asylum application is still running, you have no permission to work whatsoever. The only thing you can do is use so-called work opportunities. This is more of an occupational measure in central accommodation, where you get paid a symbolic amount of 80 cents per hour, and you can do like gardening and stuff like this. So this must not be confused with any sort of regular work and subsistence. Anyway, in terms of schooling and labor, it is important to come back to the differences of the recent wave of immigration and the earlier wave in 2015, since in Germany, talking about Ukrainians in Germany now, Ukrainians have a work permit from scratch. So they are in a completely other situation here. And in many German länder, we have discussions now going on about Ukrainian teachers being employed to teach Ukrainian students and pupils. So the German system right now is to establish a way of parallel school structures in which the Ukrainian children can be included in regular schooling as early as possible. I also read recently, but there may be experts on this here in the room, that Ukraine was very good in digitalizing their school system, so that even now they are quite successful in some sort of remote schooling. And this, of course, also changes the situation a lot. I think I have to come to a close now. So I will skip the healthcare part. I just want to lose one final word of volunteering, since this was also addressed in the chat and in several other impulses here. In Germany, as you may remember, in 2015, we had a big wave of empathy and compassion, which became famous and known as welcome culture. But for me, it was astonishing to see how quickly this form of welcome culture, welcome attitude can cool down, can sober. And you may remember that in Germany, talking about narratives, the events of the Sylvester night in Cologne were one of these public incidents which quickly led to a complete change of public sentiment, and which was accompanied in the following year by a set of highly restrictive governance and legislation in terms of asylum. So this brings me to my 4 lessons learned I have to offer, but please handle with care, since I'm still skeptical about the implementability of good practices throughout different contexts. First thing, during the emergency, I think the lesson from the German case is use all support you can get. Don't be too picky here in your partners. Build up a provisional infrastructure, even though you may not need it in 3 months to go. And accept, and this is most important for me, accept that professional standards of social work cannot always be observed. This, however, must not serve as a free ticket not to observe professional standards of social work after a certain period of normalization. On a city level, maybe most important for us today, it's an important lesson that to build transdisciplinary networks and task forces on a city level. That is, networks including policymakers, including administrators, public authorities, including labor and trade unions, including refugee self-help associations, to ensure that all the people who are affected regularly communicate and sit at one table. This was, I think, one of the success stories on the city level in Germany and helped really well. However, also here at some time, you have to move forward from an ad hoc network solution to some sort of institutionalized support infrastructure. But for the emergency time, I think this was very good. On a more systemic level, and I'm well aware that this is not something in the range of cities, I think it would be good to restrict the freedom of movement of refugees as little as possible in order to enable self-help and self-sufficiency. With particular religious minorities, such as the Yazidis in Germany, for example, we saw a great deal of chain migration. That is, they went there where existing support structures already were. And if this was impeded by state politics of dispersal, for example, you would deprive yourself of an important option of immigrant self-help. Just one last word.
Alexander, I think that we should stop here.
Yeah.
So we can give the floor to Ella. So let me ask you to stop here, and then we can be back to your lessons learned during the discussion. Okay.
I have just one sentence.
Okay, please.
Appreciate and motivate volunteers, but also make sure that they do not overstep their bounds and work on their own agendas. So in terms of volunteering, you must find the right timing to come from a period of emergency to a period of normalization and professionalization. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexander. So as you see, I'm trying to provide you with a very quick overview of the key points of each speaker. So here what we've learned and what we should keep in mind during the discussion. So this is this comparative perspective that we applied for this meeting. So also this country-dependent conditions in terms of providing support and designing and implementing reception and integration solutions. So in case of Germany, what matters is this federalism issue. Also, you've mentioned the refugee integration management, in fact, as the whole very complex system. And then you provided us with a very detailed overview of specific sectoral solutions that were applied in different fields of initial short-term and mid-term reception of asylum seekers, stressing the importance of schooling. And if I understand properly, your comments were mostly focused on the situation when we have asylum seekers under asylum procedure when they are applying for a refugee status. So we have to understand also the differences of the legal context and legal tools that are at our hands when we are thinking about international protection understood as a refugee status or subsidiary protection, and the current situation when we have the directive regarding temporary protection for the EU member states, and in case of Poland also the legal instrument called temporary protection, a bit different of how it is framed by the EU directive. Also, what we have to keep in mind is this issue of not put too many restrictions on mobility of asylum seekers. So in case of Poland, there are no restrictions. So they are free to move and to change the city. So as so far, we have no official relocation across the country, and there are no restrictions for people fleeing Ukraine. So thank you, Alexander, for this contribution. And finally, I would like to give the floor to Ella, that will also refer to initial reception conditions and experiences in Turkey. So Ella, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Marta, for the timely webinar and also for your information. One more time, we are witnessing how mass migration can be used by countries as a tool to achieve foreign policy objectives. Recently, we were here together in December for the Belarus-Poland frontier to discuss. But also before we start, we need to also keep in mind that one more time we saw that is essential to shed light on how the migration policies are connected to the foreign and domestic policies, and it is important to explain why, how, and under what conditions the internal characteristics of states intervene between their leaders' assessment. Then Lukashenko, Erdogan, Putin and Biden, we need to be really careful for the analysis. Starting with my questions, well, first of all, I would like to say that it's very difficult to reflect whatever I would like to say from the city level, because I will be reflecting our findings mainly from response projects, and we covered 4 cities, and then they were, ranking as first, 4th, and 8th in terms of their Syrian population, but also considering their exit hub and entrance cities. But also, I agree to Alexander. Despite the common legal framework, there are significant differences among those cities, and then it's very difficult, even in the same country, to find. There are good implementations in Urfa, but it was totally different in Izmir. But before, I think it's important to look in general what was the response and still of Turkey to the Syrian mass migration, because which might be the case for the other refugee hosting countries. And based on whatever we said, it's sad, then it seems likely, because when everything started by 2011, Turkey developed an assertive foreign policy and then implemented an unconditional open door policy, like it is the case now for Poland and other countries. And then it welcomed all Syrian nationals fleeing from conflict. But during the second phase, which started by the mid-2012 and continued to mid-2015, the assertive foreign policy was replaced with internalization, and then Turkey was seeking an intervention of UN Security Council, like it is the case now, which is quite familiar of today's picture, in addition to the role of NATO today. But while internalization failed, isolationism started for Turkey, and like Martin mentioned, the door of the EU will be knocked, but I'm quite pessimistic about a possible support. And within this period, I think this is the most crucial part. It became clear that the Syrian conflict was long-lasting, and there would be no possibility of international military intervention in Syria. This is crucial, and it might also be the case for Poland and other Ukrainian refugee hosting countries, because since mid-2012, open door policy turned into ad hoc practices in Turkey for the Syrians, for example. And then as of mid-2015, our analysis finds that with dear Zeynep Şahin Mencetek, says that Turkey started to use migration as a foreign policy tool, but Putin is also well aware of the destabilizing effect of large-scale refugee movements on the EU, like Belarus, as seeing the impact of the 2015 Syrian humanitarian crisis on the EU. And our research as a part of Response project showed that the fourth phase since 2019 marked the domination of restrictive border policies and repatriation and the return-centric response. And it is still the case. We are still in this phase. And then the Ukrainian refugees might face with the same scenario because the welcoming approach in Turkey turned to restrictive policies so fast for Syrian refugees, as we saw. If you turn to questions, yes, today Turkey is has been hosting the largest refugee population in the world, and 3.7 million Syrians are under temporary protection. And in terms of reception, what we can say, in Turkey, Syrians were first registered by the camp authorities under the surveillance of the Disasters and Emergency Management Authority. But despite, there were other, options, and then the conditions of the camps or the temporary, staying centers, let's say, in general, more than the 80% of the refugees prefer to settle in the cities. And but in general, we see Turkey adopted a state-centric model of reception. But as you mentioned, Marta, it is very important to state that legally, Syrians are under temporary protection in Turkey. The temporary protection regime was practiced earlier in various parts of the world, and you just mentioned the 2001 directive of temporary protection. It is quite important, but it is also very dangerous because seeing the entire issue, the crisis, as temporary and approaching this as a temporary problem and providing the temporary protection, I think the most important lesson should be taken from Turkey is the possible dangers of the temporary protection. It is quite problematic. For the material reception conditions and practices, the first 4 years in Turkey following the reception of Syrians can be considered the first period in which both authorities and the Syrians themselves regarded the crisis as a rather short-term problem, like it is the case now. In this period, meeting the temporary needs of refugees, such as accommodation, nutrition, and access to health services was prioritized and perceived more important than planning for their future. But this is the trap, because after 11 years, we still have the same problem, another problem, but we still far away to talk about the durable solutions or integration for the Syrian refugees, and they are still under the temporary protection. The second period includes the years after the first 4 years. In this period, due to the anticipation of the crisis, it would not be resolved shortly. There was mobility from the border cities towards the big cities in the western parts of the country that has more employment opportunities. Probably it will be the case also for the Ukrainian refugees. Regarding the accommodation and housing, generally, despite that the camps at the border cities were available. Now only 51,000 of Syrians there in the camps, and 3.6 million are still urban refugees. Access to livelihoods, there are important tools. We need to mention, for example, the Emergency Social Safety Net programs, ESSN, supported by the EU, is quite important, provides 1.5 million Syrians a debit card, giving them access to fixed amount of money every month. But of course, it's not sustainable, and of course, it's not enough. The financial allowances are not adequate to meet the basic needs of many refugees. Formal and informal pathways for employment, maybe we can skip this. But in terms of education and health services, I would like to say that despite the high number, Turkey recognized the right of all children in Turkey to receive an education, and 91% of school-age children are enrolled in primary education, and it is 86%. But as a good sample, maybe we can mention the circular initiated in 2014. It was talking about education services for foreign nationals, and also it introduced the concept of temporary education center. Now they are merged with the national education institutions, but at the beginning it was a good transition period, although there were problems because of the language barriers, etc., the stigmatization as well. And also another success can be seen as the healthcare services. The national law states the applicants who do not have any health insurance coverage and do not have any financial means to pay for healthcare services are to be covered by the general health insurance scheme. And it worked. And then also beside the primary health care services and public hospitals, Syrians are provided the migrant health centers. But it's problematic because we have Syrians under temporary protection, and we have the other nationals under international protection, and even their health institutions are different, and it's problematic in terms of integration, but maybe can be seen as a transition period solution. But as Professor Amachi-Düzdik stated, the possible risks after 10 years and now 11 years, we observe changes from the guest-hood and cultural intimacy to social tensions and repatriation and the return discourse. And the restricted reception policies became a tool to ensure the temporary nature of the refugee stays, and the Turkish reception system demonstrate how the responsibility of the reception refugees is delegated to the local bodies, and how the politics of subsidiarity can be associated with an extension of the reception period. In the beginning, urban refugees under temporary protection were not offered any support, and civil society organization was there and still there, but is it sustainable? Then it is the question now, despite all the efforts coming from non-state actors in Poland too. And for Turkey, regarding the lessons learned, we need to focus more on the similarities and the differences among the cases. But I would like to state that the biggest problem can be seen as approaching the issue as with a strategic temporality, providing temporary protection as Turkey did, and miscalculations and assumptions regarding the duration and the size of the humanitarian crisis now we are facing, because as Lefteris mentioned, the current numbers are different. We already reached 3 million refugees, and the duration of the situation and the numbers might be increased, and it seems likely then the initial sympathy might turn into hostility, as it was the experience in Europe. And in the long run, now we are facing in Turkey. And now it's mass migration, and estimations and calculations regarding temporality might be a problem. There are also some important differences, like Ukrainians have legal right to enter the EU and stay for 90 days. But as you mentioned, what kind of legal statuses they will have, it's quite important. And also, you just mentioned the role of the EU members, and we also don't forget the existence of the NE Pact of Migration and Asylum, because it talks about the crisis mechanism and the force majeure situation, and then we need to be quite careful about the crisis situation. should be clarified by avoiding abuse by the sites. And the crisis mechanism could be enhanced by strengthening the provisions on the solidarity mechanisms and rendering the optional the use of the border procedures. And it's already there. And then, it's not possible to be optimistic about the existing situation. And I already mentioned that sustainability, now majority of the support coming from volunteering citizens, NGOs, international organizations, but is it sustainable? And then for a long time, the Polish government held the position that that there would be no needs for, refugee centers, but now they started. But in case of Turkey, we saw that it's not quite popular, and then we will be facing with the urban refugees. And from the very last point is transparency. We took one lesson from Turkey that now we are having an economic crisis after the pandemic, and actually it's still not over. But during these periods in Turkey, there were myths, and since the economic sources are quite limited also for the Turkish citizens, those myths were created, and it created intolerance and the problems like Syrians have salary, they can go to universities without exam, they have bank cards, they don't have to pay for health services, anything. And then governments should be quite transparent, and they have to give enough information to avoid the intolerance among their citizens as well. And
Thank you, Ella. Yes, very last.
Yesterday, we heard from Professor Maji Rustic, and today he didn't use it, but I would like to use the closing verse is, he said, helping refugees and managing migration crisis is a marathon, not a sprint. And we must keep in this mind, as we saw in Turkey, even if the war is over soon, it will take time to back to normal, and perceptions regarding safety of refugees should not be underestimated. Thank you.
Thank you, Ella. Thank you, Ella. So thank you, all of you, for all the contributions. So some comments about the last contribution by Ella. So what you've mentioned is the issue of taking into account different levels of policy creation and implementation. So the domestic dimension and international context in case of EU, especially this about the EU level. And in case of EU and Turkey, this is about international, for example, refugee law. So then also you stressed a very important issue for me. So what are the dangers of applying temporary protection as kind of legal tool, so that it's not maybe the best solution we have in our hands? So you've tested it in Turkey, and as we see, there are some risks and there are some limits of applying this legal status. Also, we are in a kind of transition period, and we have to think in the long-term perspective about long-term solutions that are sustained, and about the durability. So this is just leads me to ask two general questions to all of you, independently from the questions that were asked by our audience on both chats. So so where we are in terms of the situation in Poland. Should we think about moving from short-term emergency humanitarian support through mid-term reception to long-term integration aimed at settlement and naturalization? And then should we move from spontaneous bottom-up activities by NGOs, society and local governments to the development and implementation of a coherent and comprehensive centrally managed response to the crisis by the government with the support of international stakeholders? So these are the questions. I have to connect my laptop not to be cut off. Okay, so these two questions, I think, are a good summary also of your contributions, because we are now discussing still the very recent developments, so the first 3 weeks of the crisis, but this humanitarian support period is almost done. So now we should think about reception, so this mid-term perspective, and here comes this temporary protection and temporary solutions that are offered by the new law on assistance to Ukrainians in Poland. And finally, there are the questions about the long-term integration. So how many of the people that left Ukraine will stay in Poland and other EU member states, even if the war is over. Also, we have to remember about the infrastructure and this social fabric that is simply destroyed in many countries, in many cities in Ukraine. So I will stop here, and firstly I will give the floor to our experts, and then I will come up with some questions, selected questions from the audience. So Lefteris, you would like to address some of the issues that were discussed, please.
Yes,
but
please. Just because I'm going to leave, as you know, in 10 minutes, I just wanted to say that I agree completely with, I think, one of the remarks that Ella made. When you use the word temporary or emergency, you create an environment of short-term thinking. You do not have transparency, you do not do planning, you just have a black hole where you throw money at without planning, without accountability, without anything. And there is no long term in this context of emergency. In Greece, after 7 years of crisis, we still use the word emergency, still, because it's convenient to use the word emergency, because you don't have obstacles in your policy. You say, I'm under an emergency, please help me now. And you don't need to plan. And we see that although the new pact is just a proposal, if you take all the elements of the new pact, we apply them. We just don't do it in a coherent way. Elements of the pact are in application. We are so further down the road that member states have asked derogations to the Geneva Convention, Greece amongst them. We have asked for pushbacks to be legalized. And Poland is one of the countries that refused that, because Poland said that pushbacks are already happening. We don't need to legalize them. Everyone is doing them. So let's not discuss about pushbacks. We don't need to legalize them. They are here. So we need to go into a mid-term and long-term planning, not only for Poland. It's for the whole of the EU as a union. We cannot allow 27 member states having 55 different political opinions or approaches. We need a European plan. And just to make the last point, in every major political event, in every major political crisis, the EU has failed. We are not a big actor in the context of international relations. We failed in the external policy, and now we are failing also at the institutional level. People who are talking on behalf of the EU, I'm sorry for that, do not represent us. The level of their intervention is very, very low. They do not represent the coherence of the EU, the past of the EU, or the future of the EU. We need progressive policies. We need a different approach. We need a coherent European approach, a coherent European policy, especially in the big challenges. Imagine what will happen when internationally we will recognize the term refugee, climate refugee. Still, it's not officially recognized. It has been denied, but in legal terms, at contrario, if we recognize climate refugees, it's going to be a whole new discussion. We are talking about millions of people who are going to be displaced. So for me, using terms like temporary is a very problematic approach. And as we say in Greece, there is nothing more permanent than temporary.
So
I would like to stop at this.
Yeah, so let's.
And,
Thank you. So in fact, that's very good, Lefteris, that you referred to this also European context, because, and you provided us with your assessment of to what extent it did not and does not work as far as I understand in legal and institutional terms. I see that now, so please try to stay with us as long as you can, because maybe you would like to react later. Now I would like to give the floor Maciej, who was the second, and Alexander. In the meantime, I saw also your hand, Pierluigi, so I'm not sure if it's still the case. So Maciej, Alexander, Pierluigi. So try to be concise, because then we have really a long list of questions. Maciej.
It will be my last words, I promise. So I think that we should have, three scenarios for the very near future. I think that now we should still think that many of Ukrainians refugees will come back to Ukraine in the relatively short period of time, because it is absolutely necessary to think that we should use the human capital from Ukraine to improve our economy, for example, because I think so it is our absolutely lively factor to keep strong Ukraine. That's why if we use the human capital of Ukraine in Poland, in Germany, Netherlands, and other countries, in the end of the day, the Ukraine will be much more weak than we can expect. That's why I am strongly advised to the Polish government to treat the Ukrainians still as the temporary stay. But of course, this position, this approach should be changed, depends on the situation, the development situation in Ukraine. For example, now it is really very difficult to predict what would happen in the near weeks or months. That's why in one of the article, in one of the my interview, it was the title, "Don't convert them into Poles," because it would be, I think so, very wrong approach in our, I can say, new rebuilded connections network with Ukrainians. We have to treat them as the guests, offer them whatever we want, whatever they want, whatever they need, what can we offer, but still try to convince them that after maybe months, they would be able to come back to Ukraine and rebuild the Ukraine. If the situation will change dramatically, in the worst scenario, it would be another story. But at now, I don't think that we should think about the worst scenario as possible. That's why still I think that we should call them as we should offer them temporary stay. But this situation could change in months, but not weeks. Okay, and sorry, I have to leave now. Thank you very much for this organizing this seminar. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Maciej. But we see that you were attracted by the discussion because you even stayed longer than you announced. So that's a good sign. Thank you. So you said that we should not convert the people into Poles. I agree. Also that we have to think about the issue that they may want to rebuild Ukraine, and that's true. And we can hear from many of our colleagues from Ukraine that they want to stay here in Poland, not to go to other EU member states, because they hope they will be able to get back to their homes soon, because still there are families that are broken. Please remember that the male Ukrainians age 18-60 still are in Ukraine. So the families are broken and they would like to be connected, reunited. So now, Alexander, your turn, and then Pierluigi.
I would like to briefly follow up with the two questions you asked. I think with regard to the first question, I agree with Maciej that by now you would need prophetic qualities, even to render some scenarios. I think it's almost impossible. And with regard to the second question, I'm still thinking about Lefteris' statement. I totally agree that the language of emergency must not become a language of surrender or of muddling through. But talking from the position of the cities, I don't think right now is the moment to make politics, but right now is the moment to implement concrete facilities of support. But I think in terms of sustainability, it is important to realize that after some months, it's a prerequisite to leave the voluntary informal structures behind and move on to something more substantial, more institutional. So this would be my take. I think it is right not to use the language of emergency as a language of postponing problems. But right now, if there's no emergency right now, I'm not sure whenever it is. And right now it is a matter of priority. I think that city officials care for their work on the ground and not for politics.
Thank you, Alexander. And Pierluigi.
Yes, may I, with all my respect to Alexander and Maciej, but when the Médecins Sans Frontières, John Orbinski, took the Nobel Prize in 1994 He say we are just humanitarian, so we are apolitical. But if it's taken seriously, the humanitarian act is the most political one. So we have to be careful, because when we talk about politics and humanitarianism, we are talking also about a sort of non-governmental government. Do we think about what is the average of years of refugee camps? Is 17 years, is not 6 months. There are refugee camps in Palestine, in Sahrawi, that are there since 60 years, 45 years. And I can understand the Syrians who, like the Ukrainians, want to stay very close to their house, because of course the hope is to go back soon. But as Ella was saying, they don't want to stay in refugee camps, because in refugee camps, you have a completely different perspective. While staying in a city, then the idea is that you live. Why? So I think that this idea also of long-term and short-terms, and also the emergency, I mean, still in Palestine or in the Sahrawi refugee camps or in the Adab, there are all the humanitarian emergencies, just because it's also a technical way to manage something that we don't consider politics, but it's politics. I think that we have to think also, because Lefteris was talking about climate, but I'm working on climate change and migration. But what we can see from all the data around the world is that when we talk about that, we have to talk about climate justice and mobility justice, because there is an intersectionality that is very, very strong. Here we are just scaring about millions of climate refugees who will invade us in Europe. But come on, we have to talk about the passport index. We have to talk about the fact that our passport gives access to 188 countries, while many other people, they don't have access to 30 countries, to 40 countries. And so what is this? It's not mobility justice. So I think that it's very important also to take the chance when we have this emergency, because of course, millions of people moving, if they move all together in the same direction, is an emergency. I agree, of course, but I think that we have to take advantage about that in order to talk about something that is more structured, like the climate justice, like the mobility justice.
Thank you, Pierluigi. So my main take from your comment would be that we have, so even if we now are applying this temporary protection, so in Poland, this temporary legal status is provided at least for 18 months, according to our national legal framework. So the question is, if 1 year and a half, it is still about midterm planning, or maybe it's already a long-term planning. So it's better to have the tool in our hands for short-term, midterm, and long-term perspectives, and then we apply them depending on the specific case study and the decision of these people, if they want to stay or go back. I can give you a very good example of many students applying now or addressing to my one of my universities the questions about being transferred from Ukrainian universities to Polish ones, because they want to study. So and these are not only Ukrainians, these are also students, for example, from Asia and Africa. So they want to stay in one of European countries. It's not even about the EU, just to study. And I'm sure that many of students, if they graduate in Poland, they will stay in Poland, because this is very natural that you stay there where you graduate and then you enter the labor market. So this midterm and long-term planning is also something to be kept in mind, especially that in Poland we do not have the fully developed national strategy of integration. So integration is mostly developed for the beneficiaries of international protection, but not covering temporary protection beneficiaries. So Ella, would you like to add something as our speaker, because everyone has commented, so maybe there is something you would like to add at this stage.
We are in emergency, but again, we have to be very careful, because state of emergency can be used as justifying all the problematic actions of the states, and also, of course, temporary protection. It was created with a purpose, and it's not possible in terms of mass migration, like it is the case now, when it's not possible to take the individual refugee RSD evaluations. But we have to be aware that it is diverging from granting refugee status permanently, and temporary protection eases repatriation and the crisis are over. And in the year 2022, although when it was 2011, Turkey was criticized using the term of guests, now we see all the state officials, they clearly and more confidently started to use the term guests, and because return is on the discourse. And then this is the case. And also, we have to be careful, because this time, our memories are so fresh, and there are cases, unsolved problems like Syrians and Afghans, and everything is on the floor, and then we can't be fooled, and lessons are learned and on the table, and then rather than repeating the cliche of the EU and the high-level bureaucracy, we have to speak with the facts and the lessons learned. In particular, those comparative cases are so important. The Turkey is the showcase for the implications of temporary protection.
Thank you, Ella. So now we have like 10 minutes just to go through some questions, and I would like especially focus on the questions that were asked and to some extent answered by Maciej, but the questions by Olga Stasiewicz. So my question is about Belarusian minority in Poland. Do you notice any social tension since the war was started between Belarusian brackets Russian minority and Ukrainians during your observation research? Do you expect the second wave of Belarusian migration in short time, or maybe you've already observed it? There is danger to get calling up notices by men, and many are trying to avoid that. Plus, many people express an outrage against the Lukashenko's regime and are ready to leave the country. So to summarizing Olga's issue, it's about the current situation of Belarusians living in studying, working in Poland, and we have many of them, for example, students. So if the situation, if the humanitarian crisis has influenced the relations, intergroup relations in Poland, so Belarusian Ukrainians, Russians Ukrainians, and what the future might bring. So is there anyone from the speakers, but also from the audience, that would like to address the question? So I can briefly, I think that Maciej already discussed the issue on the chat. So from my side, as an academic teacher at Warsaw School of Economics, I can, and I know that the other universities did the same. We have big groups of foreign students from the Eastern Partnership countries. So even we have sometimes more Belarusian students that very often are political, let's say, also refugees or left the country for political, humanitarian, and economic reasons. So we have more of Belarusian students than Ukrainian students. And usually, as academic teachers, we are stressing that the university is a one community. So there is no place for any divisions and any preferences. So for us, students are students. So we treat them, all of them, in the same way. So this is what happens at the universities. As far as I'm observing the situation in Warsaw, I do not see tensions. And also we know that there are many Belarusian colleagues that are providing support now to non-governmental organizations in Warsaw, just to host the people leaving Ukraine, also in terms of language, because it's about the way we can communicate with people fleeing Ukraine. So people speaking Ukrainian, but also Russian. So this is my observation. So I'm not so pessimistic as it might look like, but this is the question also about the future, because it may change with time. So simply the society, the people, different groups, social groups might be tired, and the tensions may come, obviously, and the attitudes may evolve. So this we have to keep in mind. And this phenomenon of otherness may appear. So this is also our responsibility as academics, as researchers, as teachers, but also as people living in specific districts, just to try to make this a peaceful and well developed and designed process, not to create the place and space for these tensions. So this is my feedback. I don't know, Carolina, if you want to add something briefly. Karolina Łukasiewicz, I mean. If not, I can move to. Another.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you right now. The attitudes towards accepting Ukrainian refugees are, I mean, in general, towards Ukrainians are very positive, and towards accepting Ukrainian refugees, unlike other groups of refugees, are very positive. But given how overwhelmed Polish society can soon get with hosting people, and like not sufficient response from the central government, but putting the response on ordinary people, that might very much change. Not to mention the once kids will actually enter the education system, current Polish education system includes different content that might actually trigger tensions between Polish and Ukrainian people. So we will see how it unfolds.
Okay, and now I would like to refer to the question that was asked by Nine Oepkes, if I pronounce properly, from Utrecht in the Netherlands. So here we are. There are very toxic newspaper articles and social media discussions over here about blonde hair, blue eyes, privilege, and dark-skinned people being refused. Question: are the 3% non-nationals primary male and under the age of 60%? That would fully explain treatment in another line. Framing the reception countries as Nazis may, of course, well be a Kremlin propaganda offensive as well. Would you have any comments to that? So I think that this question was addressed by Maciej and by you, Karolina, but maybe someone from our audience, our researchers from Poland, would like to comment on it. Not only the two of us.
I can just add that this kind of debate there is also in Italy, and I think that, I mean, is understandable, just because as many people I know say, so why there is this reaction now with this really, also because, I mean, a couple of weeks ago, I think that Salvini was in Poland, and then, you know, he's the one who is going around today saying they are the real refugees, the true refugees. While the other one, they have to stay home, which means Africa or Southeast Asia, and work or fight or whatever. So in this case, you know, you are fueling a narrative that is, it's a narrative of war. It's a narrative of dividing people. But at the same time, I mean, people also is aware that there is a different treatment. If we think about the special law that has also approved, like the European Union or the government, about the 2 years of temporary stay. This law is of the 1995. I mean, they thought about that law for the Bosnia war. But then we completely forgot about that. We never refer to this kind of war until now. So again, why? So I think that, you know, these are reaction of people, but also these are kind of mirror of the policies, unfortunately.
So yesterday, just to add to what you've said, yesterday I, with my colleague, I saw her here, Joanna. We've presented the overview of the current developments and of Poland's response during a spring IMISCO conference, and there was the question, a good question from this Western European perspective: what is behind this this different approach of the Polish society to Ukrainian migrants, forced migrants, and why this society is so open now, and it was not the case in the past. So one of the speakers, one of the academics, provided us with her perception of the situation. So referring, for example, to the fact that how the Ukrainians are perceived, that they are perceived by the Poles as being much closer to them. So simply the issue of perception. So Ukraine is closer. Each of us knows at least one Ukrainian. So we work with them, we study with them, we teach them. So Ukrainians have been already present in the society. Then obviously the religion issue, the cultural closeness. So these were also the arguments that were raised. Also about the structure, socio-demographic structure of the people that are fleeing. So they are mostly women with kids. So also it may have an influence and impact on the perception and on the level of the openness of the Polish society. But I would add also something that is much more pragmatic here. So it's also the fact that we know that it's not only about the security and safety of Ukraine, but also the current situation is about the safety and security and stability in the EU. And Poland is the first frontline country having eastern part of eastern border of the EU external border. So so it's not only about being very humanitarian and open and about compassion. That this is for sure here, but this is also about feeling safe, because if we do not support Ukraine as the country, so this is also about this international politics, if we do not support the people, we may find ourselves in a kind of similar situation soon. So this is something bigger than only migration related issues. Here comes also the discussion simply about the international politics and the big international struggle of power. I think so. I don't know if you would like to add something.
Ella raises her hand.
Yeah, Ella, please.
Yeah, I think we need to aware of the, the existence of the racism and, the concept of white refugees and also the acceptable refugees. It is the case also for Turkey, the different attitudes towards Syrian refugees, to Afghan refugees, and like it is the case, but also I think it gives us a kind of, possibility to face with racism and our racist approach in a way to face with them, because I mean, we can't melt everything in the racism, because I think, as you said, Marta, it's a good point, feeling secure. And there are many other issues like, language, history, culture, similarities between Poland and Ukrainians. And there are neighboring countries with large diasporas, and Eastern Europeans also know what it feels like, to feel under the suppression by Russia, maybe. But I mean, there are issues, and I mean, we have to face with the acceptable refugee concept. I mean, just look at the treatment to the Afghans now. And it was the case also for Turkey. I mean, I'm so happy to see, this situation right now, because they are coexisting now. Then we don't have right to forget, but we have a kind of ability to face with them and to compare the different things. But also, again, the national context is so important. I mean, we can't just basically say that it's racism at all, but there is another field and many opportunities for us to research.
Thank you, Ella. And just to, I have to read it. So Pierluigi says, fear unite people, better a fear than unite with, like in this case, that not against as usually happens. And also what comes to my mind is something very simple, not very academic. So we have to put, to treat separately people as the people, independently of their nationality, citizenship, etc., and the country of origin or country of residence, and the regime, political system that we have in different countries. So this is also to address Olga's questions. So we may not approve, for example, the political line of some, let's say, politicians and decision makers, I don't know, in Russia or in Belarus, but then this is about these people and the regime, political system that it's there. It has nothing to do with the people themselves. So we cannot punish people, the society, if they do not support a specific political line for being simply citizens of this. So that is why we cannot, when we have students, I cannot differentiate or treat differently my students because of their nationality. It's unacceptable, at least in my opinion, and I hope that most of my colleagues approve this line of thinking. Ella, there is something you would like to add, or just you? Okay. So as this is 4:05, I think that we should come to an end. So thank you very much for the discussion. We are very sorry not to address all the questions, and there are many more of them. The good message is that there was also up to 100 people with us during this meeting here and on Facebook. So I'm very grateful for our colleagues to join us, even if some of them left earlier. Soon we will publish the Center of Migration Research newsletter, a long one about, it will be in Polish and in English, based on our previous seminar. So how the cities and local governments responded to the first two weeks and a half of the crisis. So what were the good practices, the challenges? So still we were in this humanitarian period. And I'm sure that after this seminar, so international comparative approach, we will produce a kind of summary in English. So we'll share it with all of those that are interested. So thank you very much once again, and see you on other occasions. And yeah, let's pray.
Thank you,
if
Marta.
we believe, or let's hope for
Thank
peace.
you. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Marta, for moderating this discussion very well. Thank you.
Thank you. Olga, all the best.